Good morning. I'm David Saxon, and glad to have my wife Jamie with me. And we have been at Maranatha for 22 years. And Pastor Walker started working with us a few years ago. How long? Eight? Eight? Well, within the last couple of years, I've gotten to know him, and it's been a blessing to do so. And so it was kind of neat when this invitation came. He said, "We're going to do a Jonathan Edwards conference, and Pastor Martin is going to be teaching on Jonathan Edwards." And then I need you too. And my role is actually to set the context of the Great Awakening within which Dr. Edwards, President Edwards, developed his affectional theology. And this morning, I want to talk about context and causes of the Great Awakening. And the question I'm going to bring up is, why did so many church members need to get saved? Because the Great Awakening was not a revival in which church members were going out into the world and winning people Great Commission style, the way the church is supposed to function. I mean, some of that was taking place, as we'll see. But it was primarily preaching being done to churches full of nominal Christians who started getting saved. And in Matthew 15, Jesus quotes Isaiah 29:13, "This people honoreth me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." He could have quoted Ezekiel 33. Let me read a couple verses there that picture the generation Christ was addressing. "They come unto thee." This is Yahweh talking to Ezekiel. If you want to look at the verses, you can. These are just jumping off points. But Ezekiel 33:31, Yahweh says to Ezekiel, "They come unto thee as the people cometh, and they sit before thee as my people, and they hear thy words, and they will not do them. For with their mouth they show much love, but their heart goeth after their covetousness. And lo, thou art unto them as a very lovely song of one that has a pleasant voice and can play well on an instrument. For they hear thy words, but they do them not." That is, it's just entertaining to be at church. You know, you're religious. The population of New England in 1750 was about 340,000 people. Conservative estimates of the number of conversions during the Great Awakening between roughly 1734 and roughly 1735, although precisely the Great Awakening is 1740 to 1743. Conservative estimates are 25 to 50,000 conversions. I've heard much higher estimates in the range of 85 to 90,000. That is, estimates ranging as high as 25% of the population, but conservative estimates range from 7 to 14% of the population. That is, from 1 in 14 to 1 in 7 people in the region getting saved in one decade. There are very few revivals in the history of the world that compare to that. God was doing something very remarkable. The two things I would like to do to set the context for that revival, and I'm going to say more about that tonight when we discuss the impact of the Great Awakening, what God did through it. But this morning I want to do two things in the time that we have. You're right, that is a very tiny little clock. That's easy to ignore. First, I want to talk about, why are the churches full of unbelievers? What is the cause of this widespread nominal Christianity? And then secondly, I want to talk about revival tremors. That is, when the Great Awakening occurred, it was just not 0 to 60 in 6 months. God had been planting seeds. He had been preparing the way. And that's what he always does. And some of those revival tremors are worth considering. And I'm going to spend less time on that and more time on the Puritan conundrum. That is, these were a bunch of Puritans getting saved. And frankly, the Puritans had planted the seeds of this problem. They had created conditions for nominal Christianity. And we need to be alert to those conditions and avoid them. So Puritanism. Puritanism is a huge subject. Forgive me for being very brief, but we must be. But it was a movement intent on purifying the Anglican Church, the Church of England. It began back in the 1560s during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. It kind of peaked in the early 17th century. And these Puritans had three primary enemies, three foils that they were opposed to. Number one, they were opposed to what they called Arminianism, salvation through good works. They saw that all through the Anglican Church, people gathering together in the parishes and being good people and thinking that they were fine. They were opposed to episcopacy, episcopal polity, ruled by bishops. The Anglican Church had an archbishop and a bunch of bishops stationed around, and they told the pastors what to do, and then the pastors passed the bishops' rulings down to the people, and the people had virtually no authority over their own churches, and the pastors had limited authority. And they were opposed to what's called Erastianism. Erastianism is a church dominated by the state. That is, the queen would call the archbishop into her throne room, and she would say, "I want this." And the archbishop would say, "Yes, ma'am." And then he would gather the bishops and say, "The queen wants this." And they would say, "Yes, sir." And they would gather the pastors and say, "The queen wants this." And then pretty soon the pastors were doing something different in worship, and the people are saying, "I wonder why we're lighting those candles." Oh, the queen wanted it. And a church should not function that way, should it? And the Puritans hated that. Now, I've oversimplified, of course, but the Puritans hated Erastianism, that the government took upon itself the right and authority to run churches. So they had an agenda, and that agenda had 3 points that correspond to those 3 problems. Number one, they wanted Calvinism. Now, when you hear that word, it carries just tons and tons and tons of baggage, and frankly, the Puritans carried a lot of that baggage. They were very strong predestinarians, and they were Calvinists in the full sense. But at the heart of their push for Calvinism was salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. All right, so whatever you think about those hard questions about predestination, we can agree with that agenda, because Calvinism was for the Puritans, and there was a variety of levels of Calvinism among the Puritans. But for them, it was primarily, how does somebody get saved? Through something they do or through something Christ does? That's the question. And so they were preaching hard for supernatural salvation. Second, they wanted Presbyterianism. They said churches should not be run by politicians. Churches should be run by pastors. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm a Baptist, all right? And I believe that pastors rule in a Hebrews 13:17 sense. That is, they rule as those who will give account for your souls, which means their rule is exercised by opening the Word of God and explaining it. But as far as running the church, you're the authority, all right? That is, we believe in congregational polity. The people are the final earthly authority in a local church. These guys were not Congregationalists in England. They were Presbyterians, and they wanted the pastors to run the church. And then they wanted, third, a limited state church. And I've got to spend a minute on this because we're beginning to see the problems that are going to occur in New England. They wanted there to be one church in the country, and they wanted the government to support that church through taxes. They wanted the government to protect that church from heretics. And then they wanted the government to stay out of their affairs. They argued for that over and over and over again. We're the true church. Don't allow those Baptists or those Quakers, or don't allow all those crazy people. Establish the church, but let us Puritan pastors tell you how the church should run. How do you suppose that's going to work? It's never going to work. Once you ask the government to give you a privileged position, the government is going to feel like it has the right to tell you what to do. Erastianism always follows from a state church. And the Puritans wanted a state church. Well, under the reign of Charles I, who came to the throne in 1625, he was the son of James, that the King James Bible is named after. Charles I hated Puritans, and he launched substantial persecution against them. His archbishop was William Laud, and William Laud used the Star Chamber to drag anybody who disagreed with the government into religious court. And so John Winthrop, who was a Puritan, and he got the idea of gathering together like-minded conservatives and leaving England. Now, it was not their intention to leave the Anglican Church. They were going to be faithful Anglicans. They're just going to put an ocean between them and the bishops. So they don't leave the Anglican Church, they just leave the Anglican Church. Right? Once they arrived in Massachusetts, they said, you know what, we're still faithful Anglicans. Now, John Cotton, one of their greatest preachers, had a writ for his arrest. and was fleeing the government. And he snuck on board a ship and got a ship's captain who was favorable to his cause to sneak him out of the country, crossed the Atlantic, and he became the leading pastor in New England. Because they were opposed to the way Anglicanism was being done, but they did want a state church. They believed in that. So when they arrived in New England, what did they do? They established a state church. You say, well, David, I've always been told, in fourth grade, I was told that our forefathers came to America seeking religious liberty. There's a sense in which that's true. They wanted liberty for doing religion the way they believed it should be done. But they didn't believe in religious liberty for other people. Not even the separatists down in Plymouth. All right, the separatists rejected the Anglican Church. They said it's a corrupt church and you should not be in fellowship with it. And they were persecuted out of the country, over to the Netherlands, and then they sailed on the Mayflower and established Plymouth Colony. They were separatists. They were not Puritans. But you know what? If you lived in Plymouth, you had to agree with their theology. And if you didn't, they would kick you out. That is, religious freedom was anathema to them. They thought that was a bad idea. And so they come over and establish Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they have three interesting features. Number one, they were thoroughly reformed. Now, the Puritans typically were reformed. Why is that significant? Well, they believe the church is the new Israel. The new Israel. Israel in the Old Testament was a nation with a religion embedded in it. That is, when you were born and circumcised as a baby, you were two things, an Israelite and religiously a Jew. In fact, there's no distinction. When you say Israelite, do you mean nationality or religion? Well, the Old Testament, same thing. And Reformed Christians believed that that's how a municipality ought to work. You are born into it. We sprinkle you and say, I baptize you. And you are now two things, a citizen of the parish and a member of the parish church. They happen simultaneously. So infant baptism kind of became the platform upon which you erect this state church. Everybody in the colony is a member of the church, and they're all baptized into Christian families. So they not only held to the Reformed religion, but they required it of everyone who lived in Massachusetts Bay. It was against the law to not bring your baby for baptism. It was against the law to absent yourself from public worship. They enforced the 10 Commandments. The latter table, don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. And the first four, you can only worship one God. And by the way, we'll tell you who he is, and if you don't worship him the way we say, you're not worshiping the right God. You must celebrate the Sabbath. So there were very strict laws on what you did on the Sabbath, etc. So Reformed religion led to a state church. Now at this point, I've got to, in fairness, say that if you have a Presbyterian friend, and I have several, I have two pastor friends who are Presbyterians, they will say, listen, we're Reformed and we do not want a state church. We believe in religious liberty. How dare you Baptists say that? To which I reply, listen, study your own history. All right, you guys got dragged kicking and screaming into a world of religious liberty. Reformed religion is most comfortable when it is Israel reestablished, when it is church state. That's where it works best. And they had to argue for infant baptism, placing you into a spiritual Israel, the church, which separated from the political state. And so I'm not saying Presbyterians and Reformed people today want America to become Presbyterian. But 400 years ago, they sure did. And that's the logic of their system. I think I can fairly say that. So they established Massachusetts Bay Colony, and Governor Winthrop was a politician who was in close friendship with the key pastors, John Cotton, Shepherd, and a galaxy of wonderful preachers. And so when there was a religious disturbance, when Ann Hutchinson starts having visions, the pastors say, she's a heretic. She's destroying our faith. She's leading souls away. And Governor Winthrop puts a court together and tries her for a political offense. And she is convicted of being a heretic and expelled from the colony. That's how it functioned. Uh, they collected taxes to enforce the local parish. If you lived in Bradford, you paid taxes, and a portion of those taxes paid the salary of the minister of the Bradford Congregational Church. And you couldn't opt out of those. That's your pastor, whether you like him or not. The strange thing that happened third, they had Reformed religion, they had a strong state church, and they had congregationalism. You say, wait a minute, I thought you said they were Presbyterian. Yeah, this is really weird. Nobody has ever fully explained this. But all of these Presbyterians land in America and establish these churches where the pastors can get together like once every 6 months, but it's hard to travel through Indian-infested areas, and they're kind of spread out, and it's not civilized like over in England. And each church started sort of doing its own thing, and then they made it official. We'll let each church do its own thing. And they became congregational, which was a very odd thing. The reason that's important to us is it led to diversity. That is, even though they were all part of the same system, the churches didn't all function the same way. You'll see why that's important shortly. So what is the ideal for these Puritans? All right, I don't have visuals for you, which means there's a danger of you drifting away. So let me encapsulate where we are right now. Puritanism is a vibrant force in England trying to wrest the church away from the nominal Anglicans. They're going to succeed, by the way, in the 1640s and establish a Puritan church. It's going to be a disaster, but they're going to succeed briefly. A bunch of them have come to America and established their ideal in the New World, with the strange exception that each of the churches kind of functions independently. But it is a state church. The Puritan ideal said every adult member of a local church ought to be a believer. And they preached for conversion. Now, they sprinkled water on these little babies and said, I baptize you. But they did not believe that saved the baby. All right. Roman Catholics, Lutherans, Episcopalians, thank you, argue for baptismal regeneration. They believe that when you sprinkle the water on the little baby Episcopalian, the baby Anglican, the baby Lutheran, they are now regenerate. And unless they do something to lose that salvation, they'll go to heaven as a result of that baptism. All right, that's a heresy, significant heresy. And we probably all know people who are trusting in their infant baptism. Presbyterians and Reformed believe that it is a covenant sign. It is a sign and seal of what's going to happen later. You sprinkle water on them, they're part of a Christian family. You have every reason to believe that when they get to a certain age, they will own the covenant. They will choose salvation, but they've got to do that. They don't think they're believers. Presbyterian theology puts unbelievers into church covenant at birth and then hopes they get saved later. Well, the Puritans said they ought to get saved later, and we're going to preach for them to get saved later, and we're going to have discipline issues with the ones who refuse to get saved later, who just keep being in the church and not getting saved. We want every member of the church to be a believer or to be clearly on their way to becoming a believer. But then there's that second point in which they believe in a state church. Everyone is part of that state church from birth, and we want the state church to be in place. Now, you may be wondering, why were they so tied to a state church? Because they believed it was the source of law and order. How do we maintain godliness in a community? By making the community coextensive with the church. All right, I'm going to break from my notes for a moment to make sure this is a clear point. It's important. Sometimes you'll hear somebody say, you can't legislate morality. And somebody will respond, that's nonsense. All legislation is morality. And the source of all morality is God. God is the one who determines it. Therefore, all legislation of whatever sort that a state does is ultimately rooted in God's will. That is, God determines right from wrong. Churches teach people to be right and not wrong. Governments punish the wrong and reward the right. So it's all tied together. And the Puritans said the best way to tie that together is a church state. that if you don't have the requirement that everybody go to church and everybody honor Sabbath and everybody be moral, then you'll have anarchy. You'll have lawlessness. You'll have what we have now in 2021 in America. That is, if those Puritans lived today, they would say, you're criticizing our state church? We had it a lot better than you guys. And they felt like having people who were not truly saved, but looked like it, was worth it. Because looking Christian means everything runs well. You don't have out-and-out lawlessness. Nominal Christianity means morality, and we want morality. And you remove nominal Christianity, you undercut morality. Does that make sense? That was their logic. That was their rationale. And some people today still believe it. We still have people saying, if only America was Christian. Well, be careful what you wish for. So there is this tension, the state church and the desire for everyone being a believer. By the 1650s, now these early generations, the 1630s, the 1640s, man, when you study Puritanism, there's just revival going on. I mean, John Cotton is seeing people saved constantly, and there's all these wonderful preachers, and there's just, it's a dynamic community. Now, they've got their faults. I love Roger Williams, and they kicked him out, but they were a godly community by and large. But by the 1650s, you've got a lot of baptized, and I'm going to use the word baptized out of politeness to our Presbyterian and Reformed brethren, but when you sprinkle water on a baby, it's not baptism, but I'm going to call them baptized. These baptized people, but they're unregenerate, are attending churches all over New England because they're required to. Some of them are pretty nice, moral people, and they're starting to have their own babies, and they want to bring them for baptism. So what do you do about that? Should you baptize a baby into a covenant that the parents have never owned? That's the question. Well, you got two choices. You can say, you've never gotten saved. You've been in our church since you were an infant. You're 35 now. We're not going to baptize your baby. You're a pagan. There's no reason biblically to say, if you're a Presbyterian, that the baby of a pagan should be sanctified as part of the visible covenant. So you can say, no infant baptisms for people who've never owned the covenant. If you do that, what happens to the state church? Collapses. The parish just disintegrates. Because all those people say, well, if I can't bring my baby, I'm not coming to church. And all of a sudden, it's a huge problem. Or you find a way to preserve the state church, but abandon the ideal of a regenerate membership. And they found a way. It's called the halfway covenant. Now, they didn't call it the halfway covenant, because even when you hear the words halfway covenant, it sounds kind of like a joke. They called it large congregationalism. That was their name for it. 1657, 1662. So 1657, we're talking 28 years after the initial settlement of the Massachusetts Bay colonies in Salem. We're in the next generation now, basically one generation removed. And really, really good pastors get together to discuss this. Men like John Cotton, men like Richard Mather, godly men. And they say, we can't give up the state church. If we give it up, we give up law and order in our colonies. So, let's let people who have been baptized but have never gotten saved, let's let them bring their babies for baptism, and we'll consider them in halfway covenant with the church. Now, if you're in halfway covenant, you can't celebrate the Lord's Supper, because the Lord's Supper is for people who are truly saved. But you can attend church, and you can do everything else that's available. I mean, you won't be elected pastor. But you can be in halfway membership. And the churches across New England heard this ruling, halfway covenant. In fact, the detractors nicknamed it the halfway covenant. And there were three responses to it. One response was, you've got to be joking. Halfway covenant? You can't be in halfway covenant. And they said, we're not going to do that. Now, there was just a few churches that opposed the halfway covenant. And what happened in those towns where they said, no way. If a person gets to childbearing age and they've been in the church all those years, they've never gotten saved, We're going to tell them they're lost and no way. And in those parishes, these people left and either were unchurched or established dissenting churches, and the parish collapsed. That happened a handful of places across New England. The majority of the churches said, yeah, halfway covenant doesn't seem great, but it's the only way. We need our state church. Let's go for that. The majority of the churches embraced the halfway covenant. And at first, they said the way we will maintain purity is by not denying the Lord's Supper to anybody who's not saved. And they held the line at the Lord's Supper. So the churches are full of unbelievers, but at least you know they're unbelievers because you're only admitting believers to the Lord's Supper. And that there was an inevitable slide. Within another generation, pastors were saying, Mr. Walker is faithful and he's clean shaven and he shows up every week and he's a super nice guy. And am I going to deny him the Lord's Supper because he hasn't had some experience? Salvation is not really about having an experience. It's about being Christian. It's about being a good person and loving God and being moral. And pretty soon, this conversion experience, this narrative the Puritans required, starts kind of fading because it seems so legalistic and mean-spirited to deny people just because they don't have a story they can tell you. Because, clearly they're Christian. Look at how nice they are. And they come to church every week. And within another generation, the Lord's Supper is now being served to everybody who's there, no questions asked. Within about 2 generations after that, churches who have let that line slide are abandoning supernatural Christianity and becoming Unitarian. It's large numbers of these Puritan churches went into Unitarianism and just rejected the deity of Christ and all semblance of godliness. So one response is, no way, and the parish system collapsed. Very rare. One response is, yeah, that divided into 2 groups of churches, the one who held the line at the Lord's Supper and the ones who didn't. And the ones who didn't started growing into the majority. And then there's a third response, and that's Solomon Stoddard. Solomon Stoddard was Jonathan Edwards' maternal grandfather. And he pastored Northampton Church in Connecticut Valley, sort of middle of Massachusetts west, slightly west of the middle. The Connecticut River ran up through Massachusetts. There were a bunch of churches along that river, and he pastored the largest church, about 600 people, and he was the dominant person in western Massachusetts. Once a year, he would take his retinue and he would ride to Boston and meet with all the Boston pastors, and he was a man among equals, one of the only Westerners who was accepted. And Stoddard, who had a big personality, accepted the halfway covenant when he became pastor in 1670. 7 years later, he decided to extend the logic a little bit. He said, rather than turning away people from the Lord's Supper because they're not saved, I'm going to invite everyone to come to the Lord's Supper. And I'm going to preach it as a converting ordinance. That's what he called it, a converting ordinance. Because basically what he would say is, you are welcome to participate, whomever you are. He didn't. I don't even know that he cared if you were baptized. I could be wrong about that, but he didn't much care. And then he would preach hard on the danger of unworthy participation, and have the modern equivalent of they didn't do invitations back then, but essentially he would press hard for conversion at the Lord's Supper, and they became seasons of revival. He had 5 seasons of revival over his 59-year pastorate, in which, every time a new crop would come along that hadn't been converted yet, they'd have a big Lord's table, and he'd preach hard for them to get saved. Now, there weren't too many pastors in New England doing that, but that's kind of the next step. You go off into Unitarianism because you deny conversion. If you stress conversion and open the table, now you've got a great way to convict people. You are eating damnation to yourself. I just invited you to do that, but... Right. So that's the Stoddard position. And when Jonathan Edwards became his assistant pastor, as Dr. Martin will discuss later, he was very skeptical of that logic. But he had a church which had been imbibing that for 50 years. This man pastored the church for 59 years. So by the 1720s, most New Englanders, through the entire region, were members of parish churches. it was hard not to be. They were part of the standing order. Now, by the end of the century, you wouldn't get arrested for not showing up at church, but you wouldn't have the business connections. You were it was unlikely that you'd be elected a yeoman. You couldn't be really effective. So everybody was in the church. I mean, just basically everybody. Virtually everybody was baptized. Everybody was sprinkled as a baby. Most of them were pretty religious because, in fact, nominal Christianity typically works. That is, it's easy to honor him with your lips. And so most people did. But many were unsaved. And I think it's obvious that the seeds of this problem were planted in advancing a form of Christianity which was nominal. You say, well, this doesn't seem to have much to do with Baptists. Well, it has a lot to do with our history, as I'll talk about tonight, because the Great Awakening is going to be enormously influential for Baptists. But one of the things that has to do with Baptists is that Baptists looked at this infant baptism system, the worst forms, Catholic, Lutheran, Anglican, and the best forms, Presbyterian, Reformed, and said it doesn't matter what form it takes. You fill your church with unbelievers. It's deadly. And so Baptist theology, that drove us to the scriptures to assess whether that's really what God intended. So God began to send revival tremors, and I have 7 minutes for that. That's probably enough time. Do you have any questions over the development that I just made? I know we're in an auditorium. Maybe you never ask questions, but you're allowed to.
I have a question.
Thank you.
So graveyards, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are you allowed, if you're in the halfway covenant, are you allowed to be buried in the church graveyard?
Oh, churches that embrace the halfway covenant extended all the religious privileges to these people. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's like technically you're not saved and we think you're going to go to hell when you die, but hey, you're in the church. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So kind of as a follow-up, it sounds like they still had a distinction between people that had been saved and people that...
As long as they maintained the Lord's Supper as the barrier, which the founders, the writers of the halfway covenant, intended the Lord's Supper to be the line of defense. Now, it's still not functioning in a New Testament fashion because people who are unworthy at the Lord's Supper are supposed to be disciplined out of your church. They're messing it up pretty badly. But as long as they honored the Lord's Supper as the barrier, then there was a distinction in the church between believers and people known to be unbelievers. It's just really hard to maintain that distinction. And it didn't take long for most churches to begin waffling on that. By the time of Jonathan Edwards, there were still a few churches scattered around New England that were being really firm on not allowing unbelievers to participate in the Lord's Supper, but they were few and far between, and they were considered fundamentalists. They were considered fanatics. You know, these guys are nuts. I mean, they're judging somebody's heart. How dare they? And most churches were saying, "Hey, come on! They come to church. They're faithful. They're religious. What's the big deal? Let them celebrate." And that's the path to your church just being totally nominal. So that distinction was important. It was impractical. It couldn't survive. Well, God started working 20 years before the Great Awakening started. A couple names I want you to know for the quiz. Theodore Jacob Frelinghuysen. You say, do I have to spell it? Frelinghuysen was a Dutch pietist, young man, born about 1691. In his late 20s, he came to America. He became the pastor of 4 or 5 small Dutch Reformed congregations in the middle of New Jersey. The Dutch Reformed had the same problems as most other Reformed groups. That is, when he took over these churches, he discovered he had a whole bunch of baptized, unspiritual people. And so he started preaching for salvation. He started preaching that infant baptism doesn't save you and being good doesn't save you. And he got into a fight with his deacons, and a couple of the deacons got saved, and a couple of the deacons quit. And pretty soon, these churches are experiencing revival. The revival erupted in the 1720s. He arrived in 1719. By 1726, it was peaking, and people were getting saved all across, not just in his churches, but in other churches across New Jersey and over into eastern Pennsylvania. George Whitefield wrote in his journal about 15 years later, Among others who came to hear the word were several ministers whom the Lord has been pleased to honor in making them instruments in bringing many sons to glory. One was a Dutch Calvinistic minister named Frelinghuysen, pastor of a congregation about 4 miles from New Brunswick. He is a worthy old soldier of Jesus Christ and was the beginner. By the way, he was like 48 when Whitefield wrote he was a worthy old soldier. I was offended when I read that. He was a worthy old soldier of Jesus Christ and was the beginner of the great work, which I trust the Lord is carrying on in these parts. He says, listen, this awakening we're experiencing, God started this like 15 years ago. And then there's William Tennant. William Tennant was nearly 20 years older than Frelinghuysen. He was Scottish. He came to America 1 year before Frelinghuysen did. That is, God sends Tennant in 1718 and Frelinghuysen in 1719. They don't know each other. They're coming, one's from Netherlands, one from Scotland. Tennant sets up in Neshaminy, Pennsylvania, not very many miles from the Raritan Valley where Frelinghuysen is. And Frelinghuysen starts preaching for conversion, and Tennant starts preaching for conversion. And he establishes a little school to train ministers who will preach for conversion. The detractor said, that's just a little log college. Well, that log college produced Samuel Blair and Samuel Finley and Samuel Tennant and William Tennant Jr., and these guys were all great preachers. And they scatter out across eastern Pennsylvania, preaching to Presbyterian and Reformed people, don't trust in church. Right? Trust in Christ. We had a Reformation so that it would be supernatural salvation, not human. And now we've put infant baptism in place and it's becoming human again. God was preparing the soil. And between 1726 and 1734, there were periodic revivals all through that region that the New Englanders have very little knowledge of. But God is at work. Jonathan Edwards, in a conversation with William Tennant's son, Gilbert Tennant, who was a tremendous awakening preacher that I won't be able to say much about. But he said to Gilbert Tennant, this shower of divine blessing has been yet more extensive. There was no small degree of it in some parts of the Jerseys. As I was informed when I was in New York, Edwards pastored in New York for a year or so. In a long journey, he said, I took at that time of the year for my health. So let me pick up the quote. I was informed while I was in New York by some people of the Jerseys whom I saw, especially the Reverend Mr. William Tennant, a minister who seemed to have such things much at heart. He told me of a very great awakening of many in a place called the Mountains under the ministry of one Mr. Cross, of a very considerable revival of religion in another place under the ministry of his brother, the Reverend Mr. Gilbert Tennant. This is William Tennant Jr. who's telling him. And also at another place under the ministry of a very pious young gentleman, a Dutch minister whose name, as I remember, was Frelinghuysen. That is, Edwards said, look at what God's doing, this surprising work. And then he travels down to New York and says, oh yeah, God's been doing this for a while now. He did it there and there and there and there. So let me draw out 4 lessons in the negative 1 minute that I have left. Number 1, unbiblical doctrines lead to unbiblical practices with evil results. That is, what we believe will lead to what we do. Infant baptism is the root of many ecclesiastical errors. That's one of the main reasons I am a Baptist. Being Baptist does not equal being saved. There are believers in many denominations. And in some sense, I have fellowship with all of those fellow believers. But I tell you what, the older I live, the more thankful I am that God led me to be a Baptist, because it's the New Testament way of doing church. Separation of church and state is essential. You start blending them, you get morality, but is nominal Christianity worth it? No. The darker the world is, the brighter we can shine. We don't want a moral America around us. It'd be better for our kids, not if our kids grow up to be nominal Christians. Autonomy of the local church is a safeguard. They experienced that where some of the churches rejected the halfway covenant. Number 2, the gospel can overcome. Flawed Christians and imperfect churches can still enjoy God's blessing if they preach the gospel. As we study the Great Awakening, George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, Gilbert Tennant, all of these great preachers sprinkled babies and said, I baptize you. God still uses the gospel, all right? Which is encouraging to me because I don't get everything right either. God still uses the gospel. Number 3, God is the one who sends revival. He raises up preachers. He sets people praying. He regenerates sinners, even moral sinners who don't think they need to be saved. And number 4, God often or usually works incrementally. He does a little here that you don't see, and a little there that you don't see, and a little there, and then all of a sudden the flood comes, and it's like any pipe that leaks in your house. It starts as a drip, right? And then eventually it's just taking everything out. Well, that's how God often works. Today it may be Frelinghuysen, Tennant, the Log College. You barely notice. Tomorrow it's Edwards and Whitfield, and 1 in 7 people is getting saved. And so despise not the day of small things. All right. Thank you for your attention. That's an introduction to the Great Awakening, context and causes. Any question before I close in prayer? I'm a teacher. I don't like to leave questions unanswered. All right, let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for the opportunity to consider this theme this morning. Thank you, Lord, that we have absolute confidence in your sovereignty. Lord, you're in control of PowerPoints working or not working, of technology. You're in control of how much sleep we got and how alert we are. And Lord, you can work through all kinds of flawed circumstances. You are sovereign and omnipotent. And thank you how the Great Awakening demonstrates that. In that, Lord, it's pretty hard to miss what happened in the 1740s, but we can overlook what you were already doing when you laid it on the heart of a young Dutch minister to travel across the Atlantic in 1719. Thank you, Lord, that you are always at work. And I pray that you give us grace to trust you, to trust the still small voice and not always expect the earthquake. And I pray these things